name is Ottaviano Canuto, and I'm a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. This is the 14th of a series of short videos dealing with subjects covered in my recent book, Climbing a High Ladder: Development in the Global Economy. Previously in the series, we have already approached global value chains and trade globalization, globalization and technological learning, and the middle income trap. Today, we use those discussions to provide part of the explanation of why Brazil seems to be stuck in a middle income trap, while South Korea has climbed the ladder toward the club of advanced economies. Look at the evolution of the GDP per capita of both countries. The middle income trap may well characterize the experience of Brazil and most of Latin America since the 80s. Conversely, South Korea maintained its pace of evolution, reaching a high income status, as you can see in the chart. Such a divergence of economic growth can be related to their distinctive performance in terms of domestic accumulation of technological and organizational capabilities. In their different approaches to global value chains and trade globalization reinforced such a discrepancy in domestic accumulation process. Let's look at the accumulation of assets in both countries as estimated by the World Bank. We have been referring to this report in our previous videos on middle income trap and on natural wealth. So the table in the chart depicts what lies behind the contrasting evolution of GDP per capita of the two countries exhibited in the first chart. As expected, the relative natural resource richness of Brazil appears in the value of natural capital. Produced capital, physical capital, that is to say, machines and equipment, infrastructure, etc., in turn reflects the differences in investment ratios of GDP between the countries over the years. The differential is glaring in the case of human capital, reflecting South Korea's investments in comprehensive education of its population and success in the local development and accumulation of intangible assets, technological and organizational capabilities. But it's worth highlighting exactly four aspects of the comparative evolution of Brazil and South Korea towards what the table exhibits. First, we should keep in mind that manufacturing structures in both countries evolved in tandem with the extent of local accumulation of intangible assets, with productivity and levels of upgrade in value chains reflecting such accumulation. While both countries went through similar trajectories of heavy industrialization up to the 80s, South Korea's successful entry into higher tech mechanical electronic areas afterwards reflected a local intangible asset accumulation as part of a co-evolutionary process, rather than being the consequence of any forced protected installation of activities. Capabilities explain sectors, not contrary-wise. Second, the structure of incentives, that is to say, rewards for success as compared to punishment for failure, matters for local investment in intangible assets, because they shape the risk-weighted benefit cost calculus made by economic agents. In this regard, an important distinction between public policies in South Korea and Brazil could already be pointed out before the 80s. I did it in my PhD thesis 30 years ago. Chaebols, the Korean conglomerates, were the outcome of an evolutionary, call it Schumpeterian, process, during which success in mastering technology and productivity including contractual targets of world market share occupancy, was rewarded with additional permits and subsidized finance, whereas losers were left behind. What we know nowadays as the chaebos, they are the outcome of a process along which many other potential chaebos died in the way. Under such market emulating rules of helping winners and punishing losers, industrial policy beneficiaries did not think twice before using surpluses to invest in technological capability construction. Now, compare that with the helping winners and saving losers of Brazil's industrial policies and finance. Under such circumstance, the temptation to use the surpluses to accumulate wealth in ways to maximize frontiers of interaction with the public sector prevails against spending them with technology and productivity mastering. Brazil's long-standing high levels of trade protection and closure also favored such an option. Third aspect to take into account, Brazil has remained a middle-income country for long, among other reasons because of the coexistence of islands of high-income activities and the remaining large pool of low productivity, low education occupancy of the population. That constitutes a still untapped source for increases in total factor productivity via occupational change. Fourth, South Korea's local accumulation of intangible assets benefited from technology spillovers of globalization through trade, as we approached in our video on globalization and technological learning, whereas the global fragmentation of production processes along cross-border value chains has largely bypassed Brazil. Nevertheless, South Korea's local attributes to escalate the ladder of innovation capabilities were highly relevant to explain its appropriation of globalization's technological spillovers. Different business environments have also made a difference between Brazil and South Korea. What I want to highlight is that, as we saw in the video on globalization technological learning, is that Korea, like it has been the case of China, has combined the plenty opportunities of technological learning open through trade globalization, as we approach in the video, combined with local incentives to accumulate capabilities, including reaching the level of being an inventor, and as we saw in the figures on patents and on R&D efforts by South Korea and China in this case. So, whereas in the case of Brazil, and that's why I said that it remained delinked from new global value chains. While the international trade underwent the radical transformation in the past decades, as we approached here in the series, as production processes fragmented along cross-border value chains, the Brazilian economy remained on the fringes of this production revolution, maintaining an extremely high density of local supply chains. Opportunity costs incurred by such option taken by the country were accordingly high. The factors behind Brazil's bypassing are multiple. They include precarious logistics and high transaction costs related to international trade, as well as deliberate policy decisions to favor local content over international integration. Brazil's trade figures contrast with those of its peers and reflect the fact that the country's economy remained relatively segmented from the deep transformation that took place in the global economic geography in the last decades. And the Brazilian economy pays a price in terms of productivity foregone because of its lack of trade openness. A trade opening process would bring an adjustment impact that could nonetheless be mitigated with public policies that facilitate labor mobility and job migration. Benefits from trade opening would also hinge on policy improvements in complementary areas such as infrastructure investments, business environment, and others. The Brazilian economy is commercially closed, even when taking into account its size and location, including by looking at the non-trade restrictions that Brazil presents. But let's consider the tariffs on imports. Weighted by import shares, the average was 8.3% in 2015, when I and some colleagues made a deep study on the subject, and they were the highest among comparable emerging and advanced economies. And such tariff protection in Brazil is accompanied by the use of non-tariff barriers and local content rules that are also even more intense than in those comparable countries, as you can see in the chart. The number and depth of free trade agreements to which Brazil is a signatory are also limited. Not surprisingly, Brazil maintains a degree of density in its domestic industrial production chains above what one should expect from its level of income and development. By abdicating more advanced and externally available inputs, equipment, and technologies, such integrated chains operate at lower levels of productivity and quality than would have been the case if they had access to those inputs. Leaner and outward integrated producer chains would have greater capacity to export and to provide domestically better and cheaper products, while at the same time, their expansion could outweigh the lower domestic density. C. Embraer, Petrobras, before being subjected to heavy commitments of local content after the discovery of pre-salt layers of deep sea oil, and agriculture, and some specific case of companies. They are examples of Brazilian successes that constitute exceptions, confirming what I said about the trade closure. The point is that the fear of loss of local production segments with high technological content must be countered by the fact that their domestic survival due to protection steroids does not necessarily mean local technological dominance and tends to be done while imposing a burden on others. A cheapening of the basket of goods might well mean lower wages and intermediary costs for those areas where the country can develop local capacity for value added generation. Therefore, the Brazilian economy suffers from high costs because of its trade closure. What the country produces could be done with greater productivity and competitiveness, even if it abdicated to do internally what it would import, if it could have access to the best and most advanced equipment and technology. Incidentally, recent historical experience shows that countries that are not at the technological frontier and those that are both there, they both have better results in terms of local technological innovation when they can benefit from access to external sources of knowledge, including via imports of goods and service. In a nutshell, the different paths of evolution of income per capita in Brazil and South Korea can be, at least in part, be explained by the different approach regarding trade globalization, as well as by different structures of microeconomic incentives considered by domestic economic agents. You will find a discussion on those topics in several chapters of my book that you can find on those places on the slide. In the next video, we will approach Brazil more closely, dealing with what I have called a double disease of productivity, anemia, and public sector obesity. Stay tuned.